of my great mentors in life was Dr. Graham Child. And when I was a young game ranger in Zimbabwe, he once said to me, "My boy, you need to remember one thing. Conservation is a human construct. It depends what your objectives are and what you want to get out of it." And in the intervening 50 years, I've reflected on that often and come to a further realization that conservation is actually often merely a statement of intent, and it's heavily dependent on political will and the capacity for governance and management. And so I've recently been doing some work in Zambia for a development agency that's thinking of providing some funding to help the Zambian government mitigate the levels of deforestation that they have in Zambia. And when I started to dig into the situation in Zambia, there were a lot of frightening facts that came to be. That the loss of forest conservation across Zambia is largely because of the inadequacy of the legislation or the lack of political will, or in many cases, just the lack of capacity for the governance. A large portion of the country is covered by forests, and nearly 50 million hectares is the extent of the forests there. Beautiful place. The forest lands there are magnificent. I was talking to some people last night that have done some work there, and everybody just raves about the wonderful forests they've got there. But when you look at the loss of forests cover over the 20-year period shown there, 2001 to 2021, okay, that is a 10% loss, the purple color there. Okay, so if you actually now extrapolate that, it's about a 0.6% loss per annum. And one can see that eventually you have to get to a point where there's a significant amount, 50% of that, we're going to be losing within 50 years. Now, the big droughts that are occurring in that area now, which is another project that I've managed with the US aid, predicted that these droughts would be coming into this particular region, the southern portion of Zambia. Nearly 2 million people have been displaced because of the droughts. And so they've moved into the areas that are slightly north of them, around Kafue, and into other areas of north, into the forest areas. And so the deforestation level could actually be much higher than 0.6%, could be 0.9. And that's largely due to the use of production of charcoal, and because Zambia is heavily dependent on charcoal for their energy requirements. And so if it is 0.09, okay, 0.9% deforestation, that accelerates the level of deforestation in the country. So what are the drivers and what is our research question? Okay, so you can see in the map here that a lot of the people are moving out of the south and going on either side of Kafue, and are settling in the game management areas, which are buffer zones to the Kafue Park. Same in Lower Zambezi, and even up into the South Luangwa and North Luangwa complex. So when we look at what are the drivers, the endogenous ones are that, as I mentioned, the heavy dependence on charcoal, 80% of their requirements for energy. It's crazy, the amount of dependence on that. There isn't a single government institution, a prison, a school, a hospital, anything that doesn't cook on charcoal. And when you look at that map of deforestation that I showed you in the first slide, it's the highest level of deforestation is around where the copper belt is. They're even using it for smelting because it's cheaper than coal. So as I mentioned, the drought and the resettlement, the slash and burn agriculture, and the lack of alternative livelihood opportunities. So the research questions that we had were, which areas of the country are under greatest threat and from what? Which areas are of critical importance and why? And then what are the measures that can be taken to mitigate that? So what I did is I split the country up into 23 particular areas of concern and then looked at 5 factors: the ecosystem services, locally and nationally, and then their value to the international society as such. Looked at the protected areas in terms of biodiversity, the refuge and range of habitat. Looked at the economic values of the various elements in those areas, and then what level of change from the natural state they were at. If they were too far gone, then maybe we're not even going to be looking at trying to help them recover. Then I looked at those 5 categories against all of the 23 areas that we identified and developed a matrix that looked at threats and importance and analyzed them against each other, and in that way came up with a ranking that allowed us to find which areas were most vulnerable to deforestation and why. Okay, so I'm just going to show you one particular instance. This is the table that we developed in the matrix for the one category of the 5. And you'll see there that we looked at the water tower and water security of the water towers. We looked at the actual conduit, the dispersal of water into the river systems. We looked at the wetlands, the capacity to reduce erosion, the climate and microclimate regulation, and then mitigation and adaptation. Okay. And then we came up with a ranking system which developed a vulnerability index. So where did that take us? It took us to identify the areas of vulnerability and what was happening within the communities, and using that, we then were able to look at where the intervention needed to be. And it was generally in the game management buffer zones around the 3 main parks, Kafue, Lower Zambezi, and the Luangwa complex. And then what we looked at was, so how would we then respond with the steps to help mitigate that? And it was in 2 areas really, in the side of tourism and beneficiation of some of the natural resources, the non-timber forest products that they had there. So the logic was, by helping to enhance the beneficiation of the non-timber forest products across their value chains, that would increase the benefit flows to the communities. And then, for example, in the context of South Luangwa, the return on investment, to focus on that, for every kwacha spent by the government, the return was 16.7. And in Lower Zambezi, for every kwacha spent, the return was 28.2 kwacha. So it's huge leverage there. So the logic in there was, the premise was, by increasing the benefits to the producers, it'll entice them to protect their natural resources and reduce deforestation. So that is the conclusion. That we haven't totally completed that study yet, but there's something else that's come out of a lot of our work, and I just want to close with this. That's $3.5 trillion US. And the global wildlife economy is not secure because, 1, the international organized crime syndicates are embedded deeply in almost every country globally, and it's something that's totally out of our control. But we're focusing on the large charismatic species. That's what a lot of this has been talking about. Meanwhile, the value of the non-CITES listed species that we're not focusing to protect because they're not regulated as such, okay, that's the 3.5 trillion. The value of that stuff that's happening under the radar, going out of our airports and customs border posts in huge amounts, okay. And that's more than either of the GDPs of any of those countries listed there. And it's where we need to be filling that gap and looking at that part of the wildlife economy. Okay. Thank you very much.